Hello, this session is to talk about how destinations can protect their budgets. I probably don't need to tell anyone listening how vital this is. Alongside human capital, money is the fuel that enables us to meet our objectives, increase our yield, attract more visitors, whatever our specific KPIs are. But what we've actually seen around the world is quite a mixed picture on the subject of tourism funding. So increasingly, we had a rare example in New Zealand where they had an increase, but increasingly we're seeing budgets under pressure. Across the US, a changing political climate has seen many states there have their budgets cut, often by swinging amounts such as 50% or more. So we've seen that in Texas, in Miami, in other states across the US. We're increasingly hearing that message. In the UK, a combination of budget austerity and an unfavourable exchange rate has seen that Visit Britain saying that even actually only having a 5% budget cut one year was a good result. Now, in some ways, I think this is actually quite reasonable. We're spending taxpayers and members and donors' money, and we rightly should be held to account for that. But I think the point is that we on the inside always feel that we have a good case for this. So how do we make that case? So how do we maintain our funding? We need to think of budget defence as one of our key strategic activities as destinations. It's something that we should have a plan for the whole time. And basically, we've spent a lot of time thinking about this, researching. We've presented sessions on it at a number of conferences, including talking to destinations all around the world and going away and looking at the behavioural science behind this. So what we need to do basically is to play our aces. And those aces, if we think of them as a pyramid, are firstly allies, secondly collaboration, and thirdly evidence. And I'm going to talk you through those three things now in a little bit more detail. So let's start with our ace of hearts, our allies. In saying this, what I would say is please don't wait until your budget is under pressure. As I say, if you're thinking of it as a strategic activity, you will have laid these ideas in place a very, very long time in advance. If you think of it as a kind of marketing where you're trying to make sure that if you ever need support, you've got it on tap, because you can't build those networks of support. You can't have those allies in place overnight. You've really got to have thought of this and be thinking of it from a very long time out. So generally my advice to destinations is always think that that budget cut could come tomorrow. And I'll give you a very great example of this, which was the Christchurch earthquake. So suddenly Christchurch not only facing an absolutely devastating situation with many loss of lives, infrastructure disappeared, nothing there. At the same time, that had financial pressures on the industry, so their budget was suddenly very dramatically contracted. What could they do in that situation? Now, as it happens, they've turned that necessity into a virtue. But the point is that that was incredibly stressful for people and actually, has long-term effects on morale, etc. So always be thinking, what would be the equivalent of your Christchurch earthquake? And imagine it's coming tomorrow. How are you in place to make sure that your budget can be protected, or that you've got other sources of funding that you could draw in that situation? Talking to a lot of people, what we saw was what you actually need to do is think very carefully about who's going to have authority to the people you need to persuade. Who are the people that they're going to listen to? Because you'll be seen as a self-interested party. Obviously, you think you need budget. So what is it that you can do? Who other people would do this? And talking to many of the destinations who've been most successful in defending and actually even growing their budgets, what we do see is that internal partners like Treasury, Auditor General, for example, are very, very powerful because they're seen to have respect in terms of looking at budgets and accountability. In this context, you need to take a whole of government approach. So you need not to be thinking about your silo. You need to be scanning the horizon and saying, which are the departments that would have clout to speak on this? Then you need to be thinking also about who are the external institutes who might look at this and who again would carry weight with your stakeholders. So it's not just any institute. Who is it that people might listen to? So for example, if there's an Institute of Chartered Accountants and they would have a view on this, and you could look at that policy. If there are institutes or organisations, for example, Tourism Economics is one of our respected colleagues in the research and analysis consultancy space. If they say something and their numbers are incredibly widely respected, so what is the allies and evidence that you can draw on then? You also need to be thinking about the broader visitor economy. So don't just think about accommodation providers and attractions. Be thinking about the restaurants. Be thinking about transport companies. Be thinking about the other organisations that would be affected if your budget pipeline is shut down. And make sure that you have cultivated that. Never underestimate the value of having the public on side. You know, often as destinations, because we're in the business of bringing people in, we can forget how important our host communities are. And it's not just for successful marketing campaigns that we can leverage them. It's actually for this business of doing this, because if there's one thing we know, it's very, very hard in the modern era to do something that the public is violently objecting to. And really in bottom what we're saying is you need to know who those allies are and to be cultivating them. So this is what the work of a moment. As I say, this is about managing and thinking about those relationships and demonstrating value and knowing who to go to if you do need numbers and potentially considering this. Examples of this, so both Tourism Australia and Tourism New Zealand actually have a monitor where they test public opinions to tourism, and this is really important as tourism grows. On any given day in either of those countries, the visitor population can be equivalent to 1 in 10 people in the country. In New Zealand, it can actually often be close to a third or a half of the people in any given place may actually not be from there. So you've really got to be understanding how that feels to locals. And I've seen some interesting examples that we may share in future webinars on the subject of over-tourism about how important getting those residents on side are and how you can measure that. So know who your allies are. Have them ready to go when you need them. Now, in Florida's case, for example, that more than 50% budget cut, the legislature actually voted it through, but such was the power from the evidence of the auditors, the Office of Budget Responsibility there, from the tourism industry, and in terms of the governor taking a strategic view, he actually vetoed the bill and saved their budget. So it went right down to the wire, but that combination really did work quite well. The ace of diamonds is collaboration. And I think it's really important here to say you need to, so once you've got your ally base and you've got all of that together, you need to talk with one voice. This is not the moment for grandstanding and thinking this is about making yourself look good. This is an existential threat to your organization. It should only be you who leads it if you are the person who is best able to do this. So the organization who should lead this, or the ally who should lead this, is the one who is most likely to do that. And then everyone else needs to fall behind that, talking with one message, very, very consistently, using the same points, using the same arguments. Like I say, definitely not the moment for any big egos here. What you need to be thinking, and why I chose the symbol of the Ace of Diamonds for the element of collaboration, is if you look at my beautiful picture of a diamond well cut has many facets, but it is one diamond. It can cut through anything. A diamond can cut through glass, and it's one of the most strong and resilient of fabrics on the planet. So we need to be thinking like that and behaving like a diamond. One facet, one point, that's the point of inflection. Now, here's an example of why that is. So this was at a conference I attended. I can't tell you where or who the ex-minister was, but basically this was his comment when asked why government treated tourism in the way that it did. And his answer is, because they can. And he said, this is not a party political point about the current government. We did the same when we were in government. Because we do not have a unified voice, we do not cut through. And it's really important. If you look at the successful campaigns that business or destinations or any kind of funding has done, they have leveraged very successfully that unified voice, so that every single point at which this is discussed, people are facing a united opposition. And that tends to be something that gives politicians pause. And I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies. Now, neither of these are technically about budget funding, but I think that they do demonstrate what happens when you work together and you collaborate. I originally used this as an example at a PARTA conference, and so obviously I used it, but we're members of PARTA, and I think it was a great approach. So they were part of a campaign of what they called aligned advocacy, where all of the key peak bodies and the tourism industry worked together to lobby the UK government on the air passenger departure tax. The interesting thing here was PARTA was a key part of that, but it did not lead that initiative. It recognised that there were organisations, locally based organisations on the ground who could do that more effectively. It spoke with one consistent voice, so that the voice that the industry raised was there. And importantly, it wasn't all about me. They found the advocacy across all of these peak bodies and the industry was that they found benefits for everyone. They found a reason why everyone should care about this. So the airlines commissioned a report, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, from PwC, where they demonstrated the cost to the UK economy of the tax. They talked about social impact. They also engaged the public, as I said, so that they set up a campaign, which you can see an image of here, which was the Fair Tax on Flying campaign. And not only did they raise awareness of this, but they made it very, and what's in it for me. So you can see the bottom point on the left-hand side, burdens families going on holiday. So they made it important. They made it a hip pocket issue, or as an emotional issue for people. And better still, they made it very easy for people to participate. So you saw here, email your UK Member of Parliament, and there was actually a link there to be able to do it, and all you had to do, there was a pre-prepared letter, you could edit it if you wanted to, there was a pre-prepared letter. Now 20,000 Britons emailed their MPs in support of lowering the tax. Now, one thing that I know, listening to a lot of MPs, is they pay attention when their constituents are sending them emails about things, and 20,000 emails really provided fuel for the advocates in Parliament, those allies, to go in and say, look, we're all getting these emails. This is an issue that we're hearing from the people, it's an issue we're hearing from business, it's an issue we're hearing from exporters. So although still high, the UK did reduce the tax band. So it wasn't 100% victory, but it nevertheless was one of the very rare occasions that a government takes a tax down. If you know anything about governments and taxes, you'll know that that is an extremely rare thing and is an achievement to be celebrated. And the second big case study is in Australia, the reducing of the backpacker tax. So the government announced that it was going to change the taxation arrangements from backpackers, and it was a fairly significant and swinging imposition. So it was going from basically no tax through to a 30% plus tax. And this is one thing I'd say about budget cuts. It's very seldom at that incremental Visit Britain 4 to 5% cut. Often these cuts can be very swinging, and that was the thing here. So this was a case where it was a very dramatic impact. It gave a competitive advantage to nations like New Zealand or the UK that also offer working holiday visas. And what happened here was more than 20 different organisations who were affected came together. And what they did was, again, it included audiences who were policy priorities. So agriculture and regional development at the time were policy priorities for the government. Indeed, in Australia, where I'm based, still are. So the audiences that were important to government were part of this. And they, in fact, again, led the task force. So it was a partnership between the regional tourism organisations, the regional development agencies, and agriculture and horticulture. So all of those organisations came together, and the audiences that had most influence, that had the best lobbying, spoke to their respective ministers. And it was also very newsworthy. So agriculture, the bush, is an emotionally very important thing to Australians. So if you think about how WWF has the panda as its image, it helps it save less celebrated animals like insects that no one really cares about, because that charismatic megafauna, so the fact that we talk about polar bears and pandas when we're talking about the environment, not about spiders, this was the lobbying equivalent of that. We had the charismatic megafauna, we had the news. Now, again, were we 100% successful in overturning that tax? But we got it more than halved. More than halved was what happened. So that is a very, very significant gain for the industry. And interesting, what then happened was that began a whole series of conversations which are working together today, so that you'll see policy priorities like agritourism coming on stream. So the allies you build in doing this can be immensely helpful in not just in defending your budget, but in all sorts of other ways to your organisation. If you don't know what messages to talk about, here are my suggestions about what to talk about if all else fails. You know, often we tend to talk about money and we tend to talk about tourists. I think what we need to do is change the language. So we need to be continually talking about the economic benefits, particularly the economic benefits that matter to the voter. We need to be talking jobs. In many countries with a heavy tourism bias where budgets are under pressure, jobs for young people are particularly scarce. So we need to be talking about that. We need to be talking about amenities and backing it up. We need to provide cases, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, where we can clearly see that this particular amenity that is of benefit to the local population is facilitated by the economic benefits of tourism and our ability to bring that in. We need to talk jobs, especially for young people. And again, often there's an embarrassment in the tourism industry. And this was something when I was talking to people about it. They said, oh, but, you know, it really only creates very low paying jobs. Now, here's an interesting thing. A very, very large proportion of Fortune 500 company CEOs actually had their first paying job in tourism or hospitality. So it's a great pathway to work experience. It's a great pathway to keeping young people in regional areas. And actually, we need to remember that economies are ecosystems and that all jobs matter. And it creates sustainable employment for all sorts of people across the spectrum, so that benefit, it's particularly beneficial to young people and more marginalized communities. So there's a great story to tell here. We need to be telling people the success stories we have, and again I'll talk a bit more about evidence. We need again to be encouraging others to share them, and I think that's really important. And we need to make sure, as I said, that we reward our advocates, our leaders and our loyalty. That's really vital, that we make sure there's something in it for everyone and that we encourage and reward positive behaviours. Oh, and by the way, did I mention talk jobs? Really, you can't make that message too loud and too important about what we're doing. We need to shift the idea that tourism is somehow fluffy and an indulgence to looking at it as an engine of economic empowerment and of social capital, depending on the political conceptions of our government. Finally, now I've actually changed this. Sometimes I talk about it as the ace of clubs, as in what we'd club people over the head with. But actually, at the moment, I'm talking about it as the ace of spades, because this is what you actually need in spades. You need evidence. We need to be able to substantiate our claims with a very sound evidence base. Now, obviously, as someone who makes a living from evidence-based work and helping people make better decisions, there's a little bit of with me in this for me, so I'm going to declare an interest. But I've seen the difference it can really make, because what it does is, if we have evidence, it enables us to give our allies the talking points. There's something about the power of numbers. Used well, they can be used badly. We've seen both examples. There's something about the power of evidence and the number that helps silence arguments. It also helps us identify the messages on which we can build our collaboration. So if, for example, with the backpack attacks, there was talk about, the losses to the farming community if we couldn't get workers in to help if those numbers were to drop. That was how we were able to talk about it, was this is the threat to Australia's export industries. But it needs to be the right sort of evidence. It needs to be robust, but there's a terrible tendency to kind of overclaim these things. It needs to be, I think the most persuasive evidence is robust, but it's sound and sober. So you need to have methodologies that are well respected. Doesn't have to be the most cautious, I'd argue, not necessarily. There needs to be a little bit of imagination in that. But basically you need to be thinking about it as being robust, but it needs to be very sober. And again, I referred to the passenger movement charge. The paper that PwC did on that was really fantastic. It really wasn't grandstanding. It took a very thorough methodology. It outlined that methodology in detail. Not that I think everyone, apart from people like me, read it, but that the evidence that was there was there was a very clear connection, and they weren't kind of claiming, which you can sometimes see, like the entire economy is going to collapse if this happened. But it did talk about a very large number of jobs, and it did demonstrate a balance of payments deficit as a result of the tax. One thing that we did find, and this is not intended to criticize our return on investment research studies, which I think are very powerful and very important. But what we would say about those is we found that they were very useful when you're comparing campaigns and seeking long-term, benchmarks on what's working, and you're trying to build a long-term knowledge base on what campaigns work. But we did tend to find that, rightly or wrongly, they were treated with skepticism by politicians. And I think, so what we would say is always be using economic measures, ideally consistent ones, and ideally ones that can be compared to other industries. That's not always possible, but I would say that those tend to be much more realistic than a straightforward, we spent this money on this campaign and these measures showed this, because what we found, as I think they're great strategic tools internally, but we don't find that they generally cut the mustard with politicians. So here are some examples. So I referenced the economic study by PwC. EarthCheck do benchmarking performance and management practice, where you've got that ability to compare yourself to other people. Look for case studies. So, we've got Roger Dow of the USTA talking about the example of Pennsylvania, which has become a perfect case study for what happens when you cut budgets, and demonstrating that the cost was $324 million. The rise and forward, so the Longwoods report, this is a case study that Longwoods, where they used their ROI research over a long period of time. They used the longitudinal nature of that report, which is where I say they do have a value, to show what happens and how hard it is to pull that back. Economic impact studies, so the work that the WTTC does using Oxford Economics, who I referenced earlier, the work that they do, very, very powerful research that demonstrates and has credibility because it's consistent across markets. And as I say, very well worth checking in with your core members of the public, because you don't have tourism, you don't have support without them. What I would say on that is, don't make that a report for good news. Make that a report that's really telling you what people think. There's a terrible temptation to do that, but it's really very important to make sure you understand that. And I'd say, if you can afford it, make a particular focus of being able to look at your tourism hotspots, because that can be where things like over tourism can bite you in the bum. Now, as I said, in Florida, the governor intervened to be able to overturn the budget. But what he was able to draw on in defending that decision when it came out was the evidence of its budget office for saying, look, this is an effective department. It's actually one of the most effective departments we have in government, and it's one where we genuinely see that money spent brings more money in. And the measures that they used were incredibly trustworthy. And this was something that they were very clear helped them in doing this. In a world where people believe that what I subjectively feel is more important than evidence, you need to think what evidence means. So all of those things are really important with certain audiences, but underlying that, we need to understand what the beliefs framework of our key stakeholders is. Put simply, if you don't know what that person believes and understands about what you do, how can you talk to them and know that you hope to have their attention? If you don't know what they already believe, if you're talking to them about something they don't believe in any way, shape or form, there is absolutely no point in then having the situation where you're trying to go to them. So underlying all of that more solid and sound evidence, I believe that the missing link could potentially be to understand our stakeholders. So be checking what the beliefs areas are. And this is a framework by my old employer TNS that I continue to inform my thinking with, because I find it very useful. And it draws on a lot of behavioral psychology. So on the right hand side we see these automatic. So these are things that happen before we're even thinking about it. So what's the physical environment in which you're presenting it? How are you showing this? What shortcut measures are people's proxies for whether this is a good or bad thing? What have they done in the past? So looking at the voting record of your senators in the past, what are the sensitive points? What are the things that might help with that? What do they believe is good behaviour? So this is more their reflective side on the left. What do they believe is the right thing to do? What do they believe will be effective or the correct thing to do? What are the costs and benefits of what they're doing? So aim to understand, and this is where that knowing who your allies are and knowing what their behaviour is, which is why this is not the moment of the work of a single moment, is so important. Now, despite practicing many, if not all, of the steps that we outlined, Texas still had its budgets cut. Now, I don't know whether this was something they looked at or were able to look at, but I've always wondered whether this could be the missing link, that they came with great evidence. They had the industry on side behind them. They knew who some of their allies were. Maybe they weren't completely prepared for how swinging the cut was, but you know, they had that small period of time. But I wonder if it was, had they thought about what were the arguments that would operate with the stakeholders that they were talking to. So this is the final piece of your evidence that you need in space, is that kind of understanding of this. So I'd almost say, just as you have a database of customers, you should be having and collecting a database of the key stakeholders. Who are the people that you would do? Now, you know, the big political lobbying organizations, they know all this stuff. So I definitely think this is something that you should be thinking about. So let's try and pull that together and say, what are the 5 key insights for budget defense? And the first one is plan as though the budget cut is coming tomorrow. Imagine in your scenario plans once a year or in your strategy sessions, do a what if scenario. What would you be able to do if your funding was due to be cut by 20%, 30% or 50% tomorrow? In doing that, seek to understand the audiences that you need to persuade or you need to use to influence you. Think of it as a form of marketing and treat it like that, which means understanding who's got the authority to do this. So if you look at who your stakeholders are and who your decision makers are, who are the stakeholders who can best support your case with those people? Make your points solid but sound. So really think about what they are. There's often a tendency to overclaim. Make sure that you're not going to get you know, oh, we've heard all this before. Make sure that that's a number that sounds so solid and so definite that people can't really argue, and it gives them pause for thought to do that. So if you follow that and you follow those 3 key principles, so 5 key insights, 3 key principles, your allies, your collaboration and your evidence, you will ace it. Please feel free, as always, to get in touch with us, share your comments, share your insights, share your feedback. Discuss this, take it out to your industry and talk about it. And if you need it, there's also an infographic to download. You can download the copies of the presentation fully in PowerPoint, and there's a report as well. And if you want a quick summary, there's also a blog piece available on our blog page. So I do hope you found today's session useful, but as I say, all feedback gracefully received.